Is securing a pure and complete access to reality even possible? Can we make unfiltered objective observation of the world? Is it possible to reason without being limited by partiality? Well, according to the Perspectivist philosophical school of thought, the answer to all of these questions is no. And in this video, we'll go over what that means and entails. Let's start with an overview. The main idea of Perspectivism is that discernment is bound by perspectives. So there are no unmediated observations and there are no completely objective conclusions. As you can see on this little drawing, each eye represents a different perspective and, well, a different person, and the little view cone they have represents a perspective. And that's the only way we can interface with reality is through one of these perspectives, which gives us a partial access to the truth, but it also comes with several blind spots. So as you can see, in this drawing we have two different perspectives, and they have some level of overlap in between each other and some level of overlap with the truth, but there are also a decent amount that's completely different from the rest. And if you saw my previous video on Pyrrhonism, this would tie back to the dissent and relation from the 5 tropes of Agrippa. Now, you might believe, or it might seem as if Perspectivism and Relativism are pretty similar, but actually that's not exactly the case. Perspectivism, unlike Relativism, does believe that there probably is some truth, but it's just that our access to it is limited. And accordingly, some perspectives are truer, or at least less partial than others. And so they're not all equal. And we might have some ways to determine which perspectives are more or less partial, whereas relativism doesn't really give us any means to differentiate in between those. And so according to this view, the pursuit of knowledge is best achieved through comparing different perspectives in order to find the commonalities and the general rules that are common to different perspectives, and also to cover for different blind spots by adding more perspectives, which give us a broader understanding of what's going on. A good illustration of Perspectivism is the parable of the blind man and the elephant. It's pretty famous, you might have heard about it. And it's a story, there's a few different versions, but the general idea is you have 6 blind men who have heard stories about elephants, and they are pretty curious about their nature. Because of the stories they've heard, they've come to different theories about what an elephant might be, and one day they get an opportunity to interact with one in the flesh. And so each blind man goes and touches a different part of the elephant and comes to different conclusions. So the first one goes and interacts with the elephant's trunk and believes that it's some form of big snake. The second touches the tusk and believes that it's some form of spear. The third interacts with its ear and believes it to be some form of fan. The fourth touches the belly and believes it's like a wall. The fifth touches a leg and thinks it feels like a tree. And the last one touches a tail and believes that it's similar to some kind of rope. And then they get into a big argument about who's right, and they all believe that they've figured out the true essence of the elephant and that the others are wrong. In some versions of the story, they even come to blows about it. And in some other versions, at the end, a third-party witness that can see the elephant interrupts them and, kind of tells them that they're being stubborn and narrow-minded, and they'd have a better chances. They could have figured out the better, or at least come up with a better estimation of the true essence or truth of an elephant by collaborating and contextualizing their limited perspectives within through the addition and the combination of all of their different perspectives. So now that we've got somewhat of an idea, an understanding of Perspectivism, let's cover some useful terminology, which comes from John Nerst's blog, in particular his 2 posts, Partial Derivatives and Partial Narratives, and The Signal and the Correctives. And the corrective, you'll find them in the description of the video, and I would recommend you read them. They're very interesting, and his blog is very good in general. So let's get started with partial narratives. The idea is that, there's an overwhelming amount of information and moving pieces in reality, and so we are somewhat limited in our ability to understand things. And so in order for us to have a simple enough model to try and understand and interpret reality, we kind of need to simplify it around a few variables, which will give a massive influence to. And so usually, right, as the narrative part implies, they're kind of framed as in forms of stories, roughly speaking. They kind of give a context, an explanation. There's somewhat of a moral of the story, which kind of gives meaning and direction, and they help us make sense of the world. So on the plus side, they help us, be able to apprehend the world that is so complicated by simplifying it for us. But on the downsides, because it gives us this meaning and direction and convenient stories, we can get overly attached to it. It can become a core part of our identity, and so we can get very defensive and aggressive, trying to defend it. We can become pretty dogmatic and closed-minded. And the problem is that because it's a partial narrative and that it's focusing on one variable rather than other relevant variables, it's only partial. It's only one side of the story, and so you can miss up a lot of important information if you only focus on one. And if you want an example, if we go back to the story of the elephant, each body part could represent a different partial narrative to see the elephant through by focusing on one specific body part. Now, there are two different types of partial narratives that we can differentiate: signals and correctives. A signal is a partial narrative that centers on a variable that we believe to be most relevant and central and important in explaining reality. However, as we've seen, partial narratives are partial, so basically they don't work all the time. Sometimes when you are faced with reality, something won't fit with your signal, or it won't be able to explain every phenomenon, and that's where corrective come in. And corrective are other partial narratives, usually that kind of run in a contrary direction to our signal, that we use as course correction. But usually we kind of really like to focus more on our signal, and then sometimes we'll use the corrective to kind of say, okay, that sometimes you have to pay attention to the secondary factor, but what we really care about is our signal. And so I give here two examples, but we can also use the body parts of the elephant. Once again, maybe someone would believe that focusing on the trunk or the tusk would be the most relevant way to simplify the elephant and symbolize it. In the example I've listed on this slide, in terms of the origin of behavior, nature versus nurture is a age-long debate that's been going on. Nowadays, I think the general consensus is that it's somewhat of a 50-50. I mean, maybe not exactly, but they both play an important part. But if we go back in history, at some point, some people were cartoonishly one-sided in this debate. And so, the idea is, is behavior better explained and predicted through genetic and innate properties, or through our social environment, culture, imitation, and education? And even now, some people might still put more weight to one of these two possibilities. Technically, probably even other factors you could take into account. But yeah, some people might have their signal, for example, on nature, and think that innate properties are the most important part to focus on. But they probably have to acknowledge that sometimes social environment and culture does play some effect, and so that comes in as a corrective. And then a second example, which is a bit less descriptive and more on a moral topic, would be: how do we best implement fairness? Is it through merit, so rewards based on skill and efforts invested, or should it rather be on equality, and in so doing avoid massive inequalities like obscene wealth compared to wretched poverty? And again, people will have different signals, but usually if they're not completely dogmatic, they will recognize that you kind of need to take the corrective or another viewpoint to kind of moderate or avoid your signal going to an extreme where it really misses some important parts of information. And so with these new ideas, we can see that signals are the focal points of perspectives, like that they are the, or at least our favorite perspectives, the one we believe represent the world in the best way. And they are rooted in our subjective proclivities, but they do have a massive influence on our perception and conclusions because, you know, they inform which perspectives we're going to be using most of the time to look at the world through. And a good way to summarize these general ideas comes in this quote from William James, which goes, "The history of philosophy is, to a great extent, that of a certain clash of human temperaments. Of whatever temperament a philosopher is, he tries, when philosophizing, to sing the fact of his temperament. Yet his temperament really gives him a stronger bias than any of his more strictly objective premises. It loads the evidence for him one way or the other. He trusts his temperament, wanting a universe that suits it. He believes in any representation of the universe that does suit it. Yet in the forum he can make no claim, on bare ground of his temperament, to superior discernment or authority. There arises thus a certain insincerity in our philosophic discussions. The potentest of all our premises is never mentioned." And so, as you see, this is kind of more focused on philosophy, but we can tie it back to what we've been talking about, where here temperament influenced perspectives and so doing signals, right? So, and in this idea, our temperament, or which we can correlate with our signals, are a big part of philosophical arguments, where people basically trying to make arguments that prove or push forward what they believe to be signals, but without being completely transparent about it. All right, so with all that said, now let's talk about some parallels. Because, you know, you might be tempted to say this is just idle philosophical speculation, which is typical from the humanities. But technically we do have access to objective information thanks to hard sciences. But is that truly the case? Can we really pull unbounded objective information from science? Well, maybe not. So first, I'd like to start with a little disclaimer. I'm aware that it's become a trend to use quantum physics as fuel for any dubious explanation for about any claim you can think of. And, you know, math and physics are definitely not my areas of expertise. So do take the following with a grain of salt. I'll be mostly scratching the surface and leaning on Wikipedia quotes for this section. I hope you'll indulge me nonetheless, and please do let me know in the comments if I misrepresent anything. So let's start with math. And in some ways, you know, we can think of math as the purest of science, since everything derives from pure deduction. You don't even need to use observation, so to say, and there's no way it can interfere with your conclusions. So, you know, one might be led to believe that math is complete and, you know, it's completely impartial and it's perfect, so to speak. But is that really the case? So let's cover Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and I'll just read this quote. "The first incompleteness theorem states that no consistent system of axioms whose theorems can be listed by an effective procedure, i.e. an algorithm, is capable of proving all truths about the arithmetic of natural numbers. For any such consistent formal system, there will always be statements about natural numbers that are true, but are improvable within the system. The second incompleteness theorem, an extension of the first, shows that the system cannot demonstrate its own consistency." And so, as we can see, even within math, there's still some level of partiality which comes from choosing axioms, right? With a set of specific axioms and a consistent system built around it, it can't completely demonstrate or prove itself to be absolute. And this kind of ties back to, again, if I mentioned the Pyrrhonism video, this ties back with limit of assumption and foundationalism. And we can also make some connections between axioms and perspectives. And technically it's possible in math to use different axioms and end up with a perfectly consistent and legitimate system. So for example, you know, you have Euclidean geometry and non-Euclidean geometry. So it's possible to choose different axioms and that's where the partiality comes in, or where through the axiom. So even in mass, it's not completely exempt of partiality. And now let's move on to quantum physics, or physics in general, which is another very hard science, probably one of the hardest, so to speak, science based on observation. And we'll talk about the uncertainty principle, which is also known as Heisenberg's indeterminacy principle. So it's a fundamental concept in quantum mechanics, according to which there's a limit to the precision with which certain pairs of physical properties, such as position and momentum, can be simultaneously known. Basically, the more accurately you measure one of them, the least accurately you can know the other. And this leads us to the second principle we'll see, which is a complementarity principle. And I'll just read it. The complementarity principle hold that objects have certain pairs of complementary properties which cannot all be observed or measured simultaneously, for example, position and momentum, or wave and particle properties. In modern terms, complementarity encompasses both the uncertainty principle and wave-particle duality. Niels Bohr considered one of the foundational truths of quantum mechanics to be the fact that setting up an experiment to measure one quantity of a pair, for instance, the position of an electron, excludes the possibility of measuring the other. Yet understanding both experiments is necessary to characterize the object under study. So here again, in physics, we seem to be met with some form of partiality, at least if this foundational paradigm is true, where in order to measure some aspect of reality, or at least maybe not all aspects, but for some aspects, it's only possible to measure a partial amount of properties at once. And so, in order to measure one, you have to forego others. But then you can bring them back together and have a more complete view by measuring precisely each one individually and then bringing them all together. And in this way, it's pretty similar to the idea of perspectivism. To sum it up in one sentence, I can use this quote from Heisenberg that says that what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. And now let's cover a couple of implications. So based on what we've seen, it seems that perspectives limit apprehension because they're partial, and so they limit the scope of observation available to us. But yet at the same time, it seems that if we do not have a perspective, there's no apprehension we can do in the first place. In order to get any form of information, we need to kind of choose some viewpoint that is limited, but that will give us some information. And then we can complement it with other viewpoints, but it seems to be, it seems to be a necessary part of observation. And so to an extent, you could say that some form of bias or partiality is a prerequisite for knowledge. Which would mean that dissent is vital because it's through differences that we can reach complementarity, right? If all perspectives are incomplete, then the more perspectives we have, the less blind spot there should be because they can cover for each other's blind spots. And if we want to have a more complete and well-rounded understanding of reality, so we can make wise decisions and we can discern truths better, it's probably through the mediation of several perspectives and coming to effective compromises. And then this brings us to the core of my general message, which is that dissent is not an obstacle, well, at least it doesn't have to be, but it can be a pillar of sustainable harmonious coexistence, whether it's between different people or within yourself. Because we need to have this breadth of views and different sensibilities to different aspects of reality in order to use all of this information to ensure and maintain the well-being of the community. And if that's the case, then it's probably in our best interest to foster tolerance and transparency. We want tolerance because it allows a better or broader diversity of viewpoints. Although there are some limits we can think of, like the paradox of tolerance, but I'll address this topic in an upcoming blog post. For now, let's stay focused on perspectivism. And then on the other hand, we probably also want to promote transparency, seeing as perspectives influence our conclusions. it's probably important or a good idea to disclose as much as we can our perspectives and which way we're coming at reality at, you know, where are we starting from, because it informs how we come to our conclusions. And the idea is to, the reason we'd want to do this, right, is to respect other agency and to give a better level of accuracy. It's not to just dismiss quickly perspectives because they're partial, seeing as they all are, but just to give more information. And then it also probably means that studying personality and temperaments is probably could be quite insightful, since they allow us to understand better what influence signals and how do people tend to prefer certain ways of looking at the world through. Now, there's also this idea of the conundrum of how do we know which perspective is more or less partial than another. I don't have a perfect answer, and that's not really my main point of focus. If you want to think about this and submit some of your answers, feel free to do so. My first advice, I guess, would be to try and shift your mindset to be a little bit more flexible and less desperate to find the absolute answer, and with it let go of the compulsion to basically quash all competition in order for there to be only one answer left. If you're more comfortable embracing the diversity of viewpoints and try to see where you can find value in each, there's a bit less of this pressing need to find the absolute hierarchy of perspectives. And then, with that said, in the absence of absolute answers, I think the best bet is to fall back on pragmatism. So basically, what helps us achieve our goals the most effectively. I made another video called Absolute Relativism is Absurd, which talks about this concept. And then, to give one good example of this, there's the instrumentalist argument for science, where science helps us pragmatically, because through the discoveries and conclusions we come through the scientific method, we can create a lot of technology and solution that help us on our day-to-day life on a simply pragmatic level. And I think that we can sum up this general idea with this aphorism and stats that says that all models are wrong, but some are useful. One last thought I'd like to share is this idea of objectivity versus impartiality, and why I tend to prefer impartiality, although obviously this depends on the definition we use. But from my observation, it seems that objectivity is usually used to imply a complete description of reality that's unspoiled by any blemish or bias of partiality. It's complete, it's pure, it's absolute. And I don't really know that this is possible. Whereas I would describe partiality or define it as, acknowledging you do have personal bias and you have your specific perspectives that you prefer to look at the world through, but you do take it into account and you avoid letting them exert undue influence on your assessments. When you come to conclusion, you kind of factor it in and try not to be too swayed by them. And I think that's more realistic and achievable. Obviously, some data is more objective than other, but I think the idea of absolute objectivity is misguided. All right, so that's it for this video. And the next one in this general series, we'll talk about the existentialist school of thought and the general idea of, or question of, can we find meaning and direction in spite of the uncertainty we've seen in this video and the one on Pyrrhonism. It could come up in probably the next few months. These videos are a bit more time-consuming than my usual ones, and you might want to watch the one on Pyrrhonism if you haven't already. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.